something has significantly changed over certainly the last decade, but I would argue over the last several decades in terms of how we've gone about immigration policy. And Trump's comments about Somalia and the travel bans and stuff like that, I think are emblematic of a consensus that, in the grand scheme of things, is actually a pretty recent consensus, is starting to break down now.
Well, to that point, I think we need to acknowledge that this wasn't just another press conference and this isn't just another catalyst. Something significant has just happened. And part of it is because of these conditions with respect to immigration. Part of it is because the narratives we've all been required to regurgitate, right? We've been required to say, immigrants built this country and diversity is our strength. And if you don't believe that, then you're a mean person, you're a xenophobic person, you're a bigoted person. How dare you? So now what we're going to do is we're going to analyze those claims. We're not just going to take them for granted anymore. We're going to analyze these claims. And the way we're going to do it is we're actually going to look at the stats. We're going to look at the stats pre-colonial area in the United States, like pre-13 colonies. We're going to look at what was the process of people coming over to North America, coming over to what is now the United States, forming through the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, immigration throughout the United States. We're going to look at all of that. We're going to look at those stats and we're going to answer the question: did immigrants build the country, and is diversity our strength? So the first thing that we're going to take a look at here is we're going to look. Well, I don't think we got this one. Do we have one pre-colonial?
Unfortunately, there's no hard statistics on it, but you can talk about generalities on this.
Go ahead and take it away with this graph.
Yeah, so this graph shows immigration by region to the United States from 1820 to 2020. So it's a 200-year period. 1820, about a generation after we got our independence. Now, if you look at American history before our independence, the Federalist Papers actually talks about this. John Jay was asked, who are the American people? What is this country? And he was like, we're bound together by a common culture, tradition, language, history. We are one people from one land. And what he meant by that was, we're English. So, Tina was bringing up earlier that when people are coming from other parts of the world, they're bringing their culture with them. That's a very common thing if you think about it throughout history.
And that's okay if it's a great culture.
When it is, but not all cultures are equal.
Right.
And so
but we're not allowed to notice that.
Well, you're right. But one way to think about it is when the English settled at Jamestown in the early 1600s, they didn't become Powhatan Indians when they landed at Jamestown, right? They were English. They stayed English even though they were 3,000 miles across the Atlantic. And so you look at the way that immigration, patterns follow. This is a common thing throughout history. When the Germanic tribes crossed the Rhine River in the early 5th century into Gaul, which was part of the Roman Empire at the time, they didn't become Romans. And the Romans were excellent assimilators. The Romans were able to turn Greeks into Romans. So, Greeks, Egyptians, Syrians, Etruscans, they were excellent at assimilating. But when you have a mass movement of people, right, you don't have one or two individuals, you have entire tribes, you have whole nations that are moving in. When the Franks and the Visigoths and the Vandals and the Ostrogoths, and the Alans and the Burgundians came into Gaul and into Hispania and eventually into North Africa and northern Italy, they didn't become Romans. They became Germans in a different area. And that was the end of the Western Roman Empire. It just disintegrated because the Romans were replaced by a different group of people that weren't Roman and recognized that they weren't Roman. And there was no assimilation pressure. Likewise, when the English came to Jamestown, they didn't become Indians. They were English. And they stayed English, and they rebuilt something that was very similar to England on a different continent. They were 3,000 miles away, and yet they were still English. John Smith was still English. He didn't become Indian. And they constructed a legal system. Even their architecture was similar to the English. Now, over time, they became something different. This is the process of what you would call ethnogenesis. It's the creation of a new group of people. In the same way that when the Germanic tribes came into the Roman territory in the 5th century, they weren't Germans forever. The Vandals became, the Visigoths became the first layer of what became modern day Spain. The Franks didn't stay German. They became French eventually over time. The Ostrogoths, when they came into Italy, eventually became Italians. That's why Italians are slightly different than Romans. And so groups of people can emerge over time. The English as a term, as we understand them, they didn't exist 2,000 years ago. They were Celts and Romans that were living there. But the English today are the combination of many somewhat related and somewhat different groups of people living in the same area, intermarrying, living together, and building a collective identity over time, over the course of hundreds of years. The same thing happened with Americans, right? The English came over, they colonized Jamestown, and it was almost entirely English immigration for hundreds of years. So that was a long-winded answer of the pre-colonial era, but before independence, America was effectively 100% English. It was 100% English and Protestant, not even just Catholic.
It was overwhelmingly English or the British Isles, and then this is also illustrative of the fact that when you look at the signers of the Declaration of Independence, signers of the Declaration, 56 signers, 48 of the 56 signers were born in America. The remaining 8 were immigrants born in Europe. 2 were from England, 2 from Ireland, 2 from Scotland, 1 from Northern Ireland, 1 from Wales. And then of the 48 that were born in the United States, they were overwhelmingly British, right? With some of Scottish, Welsh, or Irish. So again, it's part of the larger British Isles or Great Britain. So here's what's important to understand. The other thing that's different is when we talk about immigration versus settling. Okay, I as an individual can immigrate to your country, right? And now I'm an immigrant to your country. And presumably what I do by immigrating is I come over to your country and I assimilate into your country. Now, I bring my personality, I bring my cultural traditions and things like that, but ultimately yours is the culture which dominates that. Settling is different. Settling is when you actually go to an area that is not necessarily uninhabited, but there's not a great deal of development. There's not a great deal of, it may be inhabited to some degree, but it's not like an overwhelming population. It's usually low population density. And this goes where you set up with colonies. It's the idea that you're not just going to be an immigrant into something else which already exists. You're actually bringing your culture for the purpose of actually expanding that culture there. So it's important to understand that when we talk about immigration to the United States prior to the 13 colonies of the Declaration of Independence, we're largely talking about settlers. This is not to discount the fact that there were, tribes here in the United States, or tribes that would have became the United States. I get it. There was complex societies with respect to the Iroquois Confederation, but there was nothing with respect to the development of the population density that you saw in Europe. Does that make it right? We're not debating that right now. We're just saying what was, okay? So you had settlers. Settlers came here, settled, and developed a country. Great. What sort of country did they develop? Well, we can go to our Declaration of Independence. We can go to our Constitution. When we look at our Declaration of Independence, what do we find? Do we find a diversity of various people that signed the Declaration of Independence? No, we do not. We don't even find a diversity of Europeans. We don't even find a diversity of Western Europeans. We find an almost exclusive group of people of descent from the British Isles developing our Declaration of Independence, and then following on, because you have different signers for the Declaration of Independence versus the Constitution, but it's essentially identical with respect to ethnicity and heritage, developing our Constitution, which is why the Constitution was developed the way it was, right? And by the way, when you look at this 56 signers, it's not just about where they came from, because a lot of times your ethnic history is not the core component of your identity. Fine, let's look at what most of these people would have identified as one of the fundamental components of their identity, their religion, okay? What were they? The signers of the Declaration of Independence were overwhelmingly of Protestant church denominations. So Episcopalian or Anglican, 32. Congregationalist, 13. Presbyterian, 12. Quaker, 2. Unitarian or Rationalist, 2. Roman Catholic, 1. So what do we have? We have a government that was established by Protestants from the British Isle. Who built our government? Who settled the land and built our government? That is who did it. It was not, immigrants did not build the country in that respect. Okay. But Nick, there's so much more to building a country than just establishing, independence and establishing the very structure for which your state and federal government will operate from. Surely we can acknowledge the contributions from immigrants on other. Absolutely. Don't deny it for 1 second. Now go look at the beginning of this chart. And what do we see from 1820 to essentially 1950? The vast majority of immigration to the United States were European. And if we were to actually to dig into those European numbers, what we would find is we'd find predominantly Western European.
I have a set of numbers from 1790, which was the first census that was conducted. So this is slightly before this chart, just to kick us off with independence, because again, there weren't like data collected on this before independence because they were all coming from England basically. But if you look at these numbers here, this was immigrants before 1790 and America's population in 1790. And you see that these were African slaves. That was the one exception from outside of it, like substantial exception. We had them since 1619.
Yeah.
And you see England is the out of a country of almost 4 million, 2.1 million were directly from England. And keep in mind, this is just one part of the United Kingdom, right?
Yeah.
The rest of them are effectively coming from Scots-Irish. There were a few Germans. You see Scotland, Ireland, and then there were a few
Wales,
from
France.
From the Netherlands, Wales, France, and then there were 2,000 Jews and 2,000
Now, people will
Swedes.
say that this is proof that, okay, so African slaves built the country. No, they did not. I'm not saying that African slaves did not play a critical role with respect to the agrarian economies of the South. They absolutely did. But again, when we talk about building the country, when we talk about the various infrastructure that made the United States what it was, they did not have a great deal of influence on that process.
There were as many Scots, Irish, and Germans in 1790 as there were African slaves.
Well, and the difference is also, and look, this none of what I'm saying right here is to take away from what I believe is the sin of slavery. But it's also important to understand when we're talking about building a country, building a nation, and what do we think of with respect to the social, political, religious, cultural, economic institutions, we have our answer. We have our answer. Now, again, go back to the previous chart. This is what you see as immigration to the United States all the way to pre-World War II. So, again, I would. This is not to take away from immigrant contributions, but I'm a little bit tired of hearing that nope, it's just immigrants that built the country, because all the way up until pre-World War II, even the people that were coming to this country, the country was originally established by predominantly people that were born in the colonies of British descent. Other people came on largely from Western Europe. Now, what is obviously a lot of fighting among European countries. However, generally speaking, Protestant or Catholic, which means Christian. On top of that, you also have a lot of similar traditions with respect to holidays, things they celebrate. You have, intermarriage. You have a number of things that are taking place, which would cause me to, let's put it this way. I would be far more aware of the rules, the general unwritten rules and traditions of society if you placed me, an American of Portuguese and Scots-Irish descent, if you placed me in Paris, France, I would be far more, maybe not Paris these days, if you were to place me in France 20 years ago, I'd be far more familiar with the rules and cultural traditions, despite the fact that I'm not French and I've never spent much time in France, than if you put me in Uganda. Okay, that's not by accident. That's because of the migration patterns that took place within Europe. It's because of all of those things. Okay, so that's what influenced and effectively built and drove the cultural, economic, social, political, and religious institutions within the United States of America. That's what did it. All right. Now, the other thing I want to talk about is what is the difference with respect to the experience of the immigrant? If you were coming to the United States, especially in the 19th century, but we could argue largely all the way pre-World War II. If you were coming to the United States, we'll say in 1870, you were probably fleeing some sort of conflict or some sort of rigid system which prevented you from being able to either have as much control over your property as you wanted. In many cases, the government could arbitrarily confiscate your property, take your property, but prevent you from doing things that in America would have seemed absurd to prevent you from doing so. So what do? Well, you scrape together every last penny you have. You get your family together on a boat where you are basically staying in an overcrowded portion of the boat in order to make it to the United States. You probably come in through Ellis Island or one of the other major ports of entry, and you show up, and which federal welfare programs are available to sustain you? None. They don't exist. Which state welfare programs are available to sustain you? For the most part, none. They probably don't exist. Really, so then how do you survive? Well, it's one of two ways. Either you have local charitable groups, which are sometimes ethnic in nature. You had various Irish communities, Italian communities, etc. Or you had religious communities. You had religious charities that might provide you some means of not starving to death or help get you placed in a field where you could actually make your own living. But it was automatically expected that if you were coming to the United States, two things were understood. One, you were coming to become an American, and you were happy and excited about that prospect. Two, you were going to make it on your own. You were going to make it. You were not coming to the United States for goodies. You were coming to the United States for opportunities. That's why you were coming. And you were grateful for them because you knew exactly what it was to be deprived of them in other places. What happened post-World War II? Well, post-World War II, we changed the rules altogether. But what you end up seeing is now this is where we get a massive influx from other cultures, largely outside of the traditional social, economic, political, and religious traditions of the United States and the British Isles, and you could argue the larger Western European countries. This is where we start importing tens of millions of people over the last several decades that did not necessarily share those traditions. The other thing that you see, especially after the 1960s, you see the creation of a massive welfare state, both on the federal and the state level. And where does that get us? So what is the process now for immigrating to the United States? Oh, okay. Well, I come into the United States probably illegally. I come in illegally, and then when I get caught, I claim asylum status. And then what happens, especially under something like the Joe Biden regime, is you get a court date. You get a court date to demonstrate whether or not you actually can legally file for asylum based off of international law and U.S. law. When you get your court date, you ignore it. You ignore your court date, and then you go down, if you're in Southern California, you go down to MacArthur Park and you buy illegal documentation. You get a Social Security card, you get a driver's license, and then what do? You sign up for welfare benefits. Even if you don't sign up for welfare benefits, right? Because that's a common claim made by Cato Institute and others. Oh, they're not even eligible for it. Oh, because we all know if you're not eligible for something, there's no illegal way to get access to it, right? But what happens to your kids? Well, they get to go to public school. Okay, does that cost anything? Yeah, of course it does. What if you want to go have a child? Are you forced to actually pay for the medical bills associated with you going in and going to the hospital? Nope, because of Entella laws. You can't be denied access to care based off of your inability to pay. Okay, so what about the taxes that you do pay? Are you paying federal income taxes? Maybe if you actually got a fake Social Security card, you might have to pay some there. You're going to pay property taxes some way. You're going to pay sales taxes some way. But the bottom line is you're not paying the same percentage of your income as a United States citizen. And there's all kinds of illegal ways for you to be able to get access to benefits. And there's a bunch of legal ways for you to get access to benefits. Not to mention the fact that in some of these cases where you have large-scale populations either crossing the border from the south or you have refugee status of people coming in from places like Afghanistan or Somalia, you're not coming over in a trickle. It's not one or two families coming. No, it's thousands of people coming over at a time and then all going to the same location and setting up their own communities. So there is no assimilation. Why would you? It used to be part of the reason why you had to assimilate was because if you wanted to actually be effective, you had to be able to speak the language. You had to be able to take on certain traditions. Because in high trust societies, one of the things that makes it capable for us to work together and trust one another, because trust is necessary for a free society, is you adopt some of those cultural traditions. You certainly don't bring over the traditions that potentially contributed to the reasons you fled your country in the first place. And yet, because of massive welfare, because of certain representation, especially within the Democratic Party, that says that assimilation is not only not something you have to do, it's bad, we have something entirely different now. The question is it working?
No, it's causing us to become very tribal. Our country is just fractured with all these different communities, like tribes. And so what happens is there's distrust between the various factions now. And I don't believe that diversity is our strength. Like they say that's a strength. It really isn't when you're so fractured.
Here's what I would say. We started this off by asking a question. Did immigrants build this country? And did and is diversity our strength? Here's what I'm going to conclude based off of what we just looked at and other things we've talked about. Settlers created our country. There's no questions that immigrants have contributed to what the United States has become. In some positive ways, and I would say more recently, more negative ways. And the reason why more negative ways recently is for precisely this reason, because diversity is not our strength. That is a stupid statement. Diversity can be a strength when there is unity of purpose. If I want to build a house, I will need a plumber. I will need an architect. I will need a carpenter. I will need an electrician. I will need someone to pour a foundation. That is a diversity of skill sets, all focused on one mission, building a house. But I can have diversity another way. I can say, I want to build a house. So I'm going to get a crackhead, a prostitute, a nurse, and an astronomer. Well, I have diversity. That's the only strength that's required, right? No, diversity of skill set, diversity of capability, diversity maybe of experience or perspective, driven toward unity of purpose for which those diverse skill sets are relevant. That is a strength. But the sort of garbage that we've had pushed upon us in order to justify what has been taking place is not a strength, and it is leading to the demise of our country because of the fractionalization that Tina mentioned.